speaking to you today about how Jesus was rejected for our sakes and how we should also be willing to be rejected for Christ. If you'd please turn with me to Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 to 46. Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 to 46. Here, another parable, there was a certain landowner who planted a vineyard and set a hedge around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a tower. And he leased it to vine dressers and went to a far country. Now when vintage time drew near, he sent his servants to the vine dressers that they might receive his fruit. And the vine dressers took his servants, beat one, killed one, and stoned another. Again he sent other servants, more than the first, and they did likewise to them. Then last of all, he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the vine dressers saw the son, they said among themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and seize his inheritance." So they took him and cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. I'm going to stop right there for a minute. So let's get the setting here. Basically, Jesus is preaching to a multitude of people, and he's telling them a parable, and in verse 40, he asks them a question. "Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine dressers?" This is their answer in verse 41. They said to him, "He will destroy those wicked men miserably and lease his vineyard to other vine dressers who will render to him the fruits in their seasons." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, 'The stone which the builder rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to a nation bearing fruits of it. And whoever falls on this stone will be broken, but on whomever it falls, it will grind him to powder." But now when the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parable, they perceived that he was speaking of them. But when they sought to lay hands on him, they feared the multitudes because they took him for a prophet. So let's just break down what we just read here. Basically, there is this landowner, and he has a vineyard. So he hires vine dressers, and vine dressers are people that tend vineyards. And he's sending servants to his vine dressers saying, "It's harvest time. We need the produce." And every time he sends a servant or servants, they get killed. And so he says, "Well, now I'm going to send my son because they're going to respect my son." So he sends his son, and then they kill his son. And every parable that Jesus tells has a meaning. And this one's is basically the landowner is God, and the vine dressers are his people, the children of Israel. And the servants are prophets that God would send to his people to turn them back to his ways. And the son is Jesus. Now, this is almost the history of the Jews in a nutshell. Basically, what God would do is he would say, "All right, you're going to do this." And then the people would say, "Okay." And then they would do what he said. And then a couple years later, then they would sin and then turn to adultery. And then God would send a prophet. And then the prophet would say, "You guys are wrong. You guys need to turn from your ways." And then they say, "Oh, we're so sorry." And then they would turn back to God's ways. And it just went on and on and on. And God had to keep sending them prophets. And one after another, he did this. And then finally, Jesus is saying now he sent his son. And so he was rejected. The vine dressers, first of all, they rejected the landowner. And then they rejected the servants. And then they rejected the son. Just as the Jewish people, in rejecting the prophets, they rejected God, the prophets, and then they eventually rejected his son. And God was rejected for us. And as Christians, we may be rejected by the world for our faith as Jesus was rejected. And we must be willing to do that. If you'd please turn with me to John chapter 15, verses 18 through 25. John chapter 15, verses 18 through 25. "If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you're of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know him who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would have no sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin. He who hates me hates my Father also. If I had not done among them the works which no one else did, they would have no sin. But now they have seen and also hated both me and my Father. But this happened, that the word might be fulfilled, which is written. Which word might be fulfilled, which is written in their law. They hated me without a cause. So in verse 18 it says, if the world hates you, just remember that they hated me way before they hated you. So we should expect this as being Christians, as the world is becoming more hostile towards Christians. And verse 20 says, if they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. So here, Jesus is also warning us of persecution. And rejection can also result in persecution. So if you have a group of people that you're a Christian, so they don't want to hang out with you, they're rejecting you. And in doing that, it can also result in persecution. There were many people that were persecuted because of their faith. For example, Peter, he was hung upside down on a cross. And before that, he was beaten very badly. And they were just going to hang him on a cross like they hung anybody else. But he said, no, hang me upside down because I don't even deserve to die as Christ died. Very humble. Stephen was stoned to death. Thomas was killed by the spear in India. He asked Jesus to send him to the worst of places to spread the gospel. And he was killed by a Hindu priest in doing that. What many people went through in the early days of the church, we can't really comprehend what they went through. They went into the Roman arena and were devoured by beasts for what they believed, fathers, mothers, children of all ages. They were burned at the stake. Many awful things. The list goes on in what they did to Christians. And why did they do this? Because they knew what Christ did for them, and they chose to follow Christ. And they knew what Christ went through. They knew that he was rejected by everyone, and they knew that he suffered greatly. And they counted it an honor to suffer for him. Let's talk a little bit about what Jesus went through. First, he was beaten, and then he was scourged. And scourging, if you watch movies, it almost looks like an Indiana Jones whip, but it really wasn't. The whip had fragments of glass and metal and sharp objects to where when they would whip, it wouldn't come back. It would stick to the person. So what they would do is they would yank it out and actually would yank out pieces of flesh, and they would lose a lot of blood, and it was an extremely gruesome process. Then after this, they forced him to carry his cross, and he was so weak after all of this that they had to have Simon of Cyrene help him carry the cross to where he was to be crucified. Then he was put on the cross. What they would do is they would lay the cross down, and then they would lay the criminal, or Jesus was not a criminal, but this was what they did to criminals back then. But they laid Jesus on the cross, and then they nailed both of his hands, and then they nailed his feet. And then the feet would go like this, and then the nail would go through the feet all the way to the cross. So a very long nail they would use. Now, I had an experience not nearly as gruesome as what Jesus went through, but this is a plaque my grandpa made me, and this once was a very long beam, and it had a nail through it, and I was at my grandma's, and we were playing Cops and Robbers. Some of you may have played that, and I'm 15, but I still like to have fun, so they had rubble and stuff, and there was snow about this high, and I was running, and I got away. I'm always a criminal, and then I stepped on it, and then I stepped back up, and my foot went all the way down until the nail poked out of my foot. Not fun, I can tell you that. And then I ran into the house, and I thought I was dreaming. Honestly, I did. And I said, "Mom, help!" And everyone came running, and then they cleaned up my wound, and I was okay. But I can tell you right now, having a nail through one foot, let alone both feet and hands, and to breathe, they would have to push up on that nail to get a breath and then come back down. So, very gruesome process. Now, I'm not saying that we're all going to have to go through the persecution that the early church did went through because of their faith, but I'm not saying that we're not going to face persecution in the future. The world is becoming more hostile towards Christianity. Countries like China, India, Africa, places like the Middle East, they're hostile towards Christianity, and it is dangerous to even go to church there, and people risk their lives. People are not only being persecuted, but being rejected by their families. If you're in a Muslim home and you become a Christian, they want nothing to do with you. It doesn't matter if you're a son, daughter, wife, it doesn't matter. You're out of the home, and they want nothing to do with you. So they're rejected by their family, and the family does not want to see you again. And they do this because they choose to follow Christ and stand for their faith. They choose rejection and persecution for the sake of the gospel. So I ask you, are you ready to be persecuted as the early church was? And are you ready to be rejected for Christ's sake? And please remember how Christ was rejected for you and me. God bless you. Thank you.